Thank you all for being here. My name is Matt Wetstein. I'm the president of the board of Better Ballot Iowa. I'm a volunteer. I don't do this for a living. I'm very excited to have our panelists who are nationally recognized experts with a lot of experience on this. I've learned a lot in the 2 years I've been doing this. But I would never consider myself to be an expert. So it's good to have real knowledgeable folks here. Very briefly, an introduction to Better Ballot Iowa. The short of our organization is that we're committed to systemic nonpartisan voting reforms aimed at making our Republican form of government here in America work better. We embrace the idea of political innovation, new ideas in politics. It's something that might seem radical, but really is kind of the most traditionally American thing we can do. It's something our founding fathers expected of us. And the idea of bringing the best ideas of what are available in the day into making democracy work better. We're nonpartisan, we're volunteer driven. Like I said, I'm a volunteer myself. We're by Iowans for Iowans. We're a 501c3 and our mission is primarily educational. We do advocate for ranked choice voting as a very good solution to a lot of problems in Iowa. But honestly, especially at this point in our conversation, I'm just excited to see so many people participating in that conversation. I think there's a lot of value in it in itself. And it's not a typo. I put nonpartisan twice because it's a very important virtue and value to us. Our constituency, which right now is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Iowans on our list, includes folks from all across the spectrum: Republicans, Democrats, independents, third-party voters. And we really, as an organization, want to engage with, talk with, and have constructive relationships with folks from all of the parties and everything in between. So I'm going to start out by sort of summarizing in a very broad sense where the idea of ranked choice voting sits and what some of the virtues are, and comparing it to the most common prevalent form of voting in America presently, the one that you all are most familiar with, which I'm calling here single choice voting, but is often referred to as plurality voting. And one of the fundamental problems that our organization is interested in solving is what's known as the spoiler effect, that if you have more than two strong candidates in an election, it can kind of break the outcome. And in this simple schematic, you could see a case where the voters strongly prefer one candidate over another. But you could also imagine a case where a new candidate enters the race, and if that new candidate is ideologically closer or more similar to the first candidate, they could split the vote and hand the win over to another candidate. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about this is that not only did the no candidate win with a majority of the votes, but in this particular example, the candidate who the most voters dispreferred is the one who won. And they won not because they campaigned the strongest, but simply by the accident of they didn't have as many candidates similar to them to split the vote. And so this leads to something you are all familiar with, this sort of fear of having too many choices on the ballot that necessitates having multiple rounds of elections. Iowa cities are allowed to either go with a plurality vote, but many towns and cities opt to use multi-stage elections, either a nonpartisan primary or a general followed by a runoff election. And the whole purpose of that is to avoid the situation that I just described. The only problem is having primaries and having runoff elections, as many of the folks on this call are well aware, is very complex, a lot of effort, time, and of course, money. And the other aspect of this, which we'll talk about in the scope of this panel, is that very often when you have a situation where giving my vote to one candidate takes it away from another one that I might like, it leads to a sort of zero-sum thinking. And very often these elections reduce to two-way races. And a lot of folks on this call, I'm sure, and I can certainly speak for myself, are concerned with the increasing polarization of community politics. And I think there's a sense that a lot of Iowans embrace, which is that our counties, our cities shouldn't be mired in the kind of tensions that we're seeing at the national level. But when elections reduce to two choices, that very often plays into how the local elections unfold. In contrast, the idea of ranked choice voting is that it is not the only, but it is probably the most prevalent, certainly in the US and possibly worldwide, system that's designed to handle more than two candidates. And it's not perfect. No voting system is perfect, but certainly with the data that we have, it has a very good track record of resolving elections with multiple candidates. This allows you to combine two elections or a series of runoffs into a single election. That's why this is sometimes called instant runoff voting. And because of this idea of broad competition for a large constituency, and because candidates are trying to win second and third place votes, there's an incentive to, rather than talk in negative campaigning terms, to instead frame the campaign why you should vote for me, and to talk to your opponent's base and say, look, you prefer my opponent, but at least rank me as your number two. And Carolyn Tolbert, who's on this call, this is an area that she's done research on, so I'm very excited to hear from her on that. This is just a simple example of a ballot. The idea is that voters are able to rank the candidates in preference order. This allows voters to express an opinion first and foremost on the candidate that they want the most. But then if there are three other candidates, which of those three do they prefer? Under a ranked choice voting ballot, they can express that. Now, in this example ballot, I purposefully left the last candidate off just to illustrate that voters don't have to rank candidates that they don't like or don't want to rank. It's nice because it gives voters more voice, but it also provides elected leaders with a better sense of where they stand with their constituency. Just to show you very schematically how an election might work, in the example I showed you before, if it was a ranked choice voting election, the candidate with the least votes would be eliminated and their voters' votes would go to their next choice. Now, this is functionally no different than holding a runoff election, except that instead of having to call the voters back to a completely separate election on a different day, they've already marked on their ballot their second choice, meaning if my candidate was eliminated and I had to come back for a runoff, this is who I would prefer. I did purposefully in this schematic show you inactive ballots. In ranked choice voting elections, a real world feature is that sometimes voters don't rank all of the candidates. The few things that I'd like to say about that is it's the voter's choice, and the other important point to make here is that in many cases, and arguably in most cases that we see in the data, the rates of voters who choose not to rank candidates is smaller than the number of voters that don't show up to runoff elections and primaries. And so while this is an unfortunate thing, we'd all like elections to have such engaging candidates that all of the voters are excited about all of them. In many ways, it's still a better feature than having two-round elections. A lot of folks are unfamiliar with ranked choice voting, but I just want to briefly say that it's a fairly well-established system. In the last election cycle, 63 jurisdictions were using it, including 2 states, Maine and Alaska. There may be 2 more states joining in this next election cycle, 2024, Nevada and Oregon. So it's a very exciting time for this issue, and lots of cities use it. It's used in many contexts. And to give you kind of the numbers, 628 elections have been conducted in the US involving about 15 million voters. So there's a lot of data and a lot of experience now to draw from. It's been used for over a century worldwide. One of the reasons why we embraced this when we decided to start Better Ballot Iowa is that we feel very strongly this is an issue that has potential for support across the spectrum. And as I've said, we work with folks on both sides of the aisle, and we have supporters on all sides of the aisle. The general benefits are, as I've already said, you're able to consolidate 2 elections into a single one. As many of you know, that saves money in the long run. And it means broader voter participation. One of the things that we know in the literature is very robust is that if you have 2 elections and you consolidate them in one, you do see a boost in turnout. There's an idea of legitimacy, that the winner has a broad mandate. I'll defer more to Carolyn, but there's this idea of more positive campaigning. And there is a very interesting, I would say it's not definitive yet, but intriguing possibility that representation under ranked choice voting is better. And an example that came up at the state auditors or the county auditors statewide meeting is that representation of women in cities that use ranked choice voting is much better than in cities that don't. And that's possibly because of less gatekeeping when you have multiple rounds of elections and such. In Iowa, ranked choice voting is, the legality of it is not clear. It's not explicitly illegal, but there are features in the code about how ballot is designed and how many bubbles voters are allowed to fill out that might preclude it. Our bill, and we'll drop the link, but the bill HSB 183, it really walks through each of those components. So if you read through the bill HSB 183, it'll sort of address which parts of the code need clarification. And that brings us to the reason why a lot of you all are here, which is Bill HSB 183, which was introduced in the last legislative session. And there's hope and strong expectation that it will be reintroduced in this legislative session. For those who are new to it, it was introduced by Jane Bloomingdale, who is the chair of the State Government Committee. And basically what it does is it creates new options for cities. It provides a clear legal pathway for cities to opt to use ranked choice voting. And also the important thing about what the bill does is it defines what ranked choice voting is to minimize the chances of doing things wrong or out of best practices based on what the experience is nationally. What it does not do is it does not compel change. It does not compel any Iowa city to adopt ranked choice voting. It is purely a new option on the table. For those of you who are election administrators, you're going to be hearing more extensively from our panelist, Josh, about the experience of adopting it newly in a city for a county auditor. But I'll kind of lay out for you that in 95 out of 99 Iowa counties, the machines are already compatible. The tabulation software is free, and the RCV Resource Center that our panelist Chris Hughs is representing gave us an A for our state's readiness. Now, that doesn't mean that one can just flip a switch. You still need to address ballot design, which is a generally solved problem, but needs to be adapted for Iowa. Flying in a consultant to help with the RCV tabulation software. One needs a central tabulation computer, and there's some questions about the logistics of that. And then voter education and outreach and staff volunteer retraining are probably the dominant initial costs of adoption and the hardest and most important parts, because if you don't educate the voters on what's being changed, then you could have frustrated voters. You know, a lot of folks are afraid of change, and especially in local government, you all are doing a good job when you don't hear from people and the potholes are repaired and the voters are happy. But as much as the status quo can be a positive thing, there's also challenges that it presents. As again, many folks know, 2 elections. Runoffs and primaries are very expensive, and added up, they might amount to a lot of expense. You only have 30 days to resolve recounts between primaries or runoffs, and get the ballots printed. And then, of course, there's the low turnout. This is an example from Cedar Rapids, where you have elections with a drop of as much as 64% in turnout, and typically for primaries, the turnout is even lower. Plurality elections, a lot of folks applaud at the idea of getting rid of these extra elections, but I will point out that plurality elections can be more problematic. As soon as Des Moines got rid of their runoff system, a city council member was elected with only 46.8% of the vote. In cities like Spencer, Iowa, it is not uncommon to have results like this, where the winner had less than 32% 50% of the vote and won by a margin of 0.3%. And all of those voters in gray didn't have a say in which of the two frontrunners should win because they had voted for other candidates. And so there is a problem with how to manage elections that have more than two candidates. With that, I'm just going to wrap up by laying out and introducing our panelists. Chris Hughs is with the RCV Resource Center. He's particularly well suited to talk about legal and technical aspects of the election. Josh Daniels is a county auditor from Utah County in Utah who helped oversee the transition to ranked choice voting in Utah. He'll be able to talk a lot about his experience with the adoption of ranked choice voting. And Carolyn Tolbert is a researcher here at University of Iowa, here in Iowa, who's nationally recognized and has done a lot of work in sort of the bird's eye view, looking at 20 years of data from RCV elections. Of course, all of them are probably qualified to talk about any of these topics, and I invite them to. But those are sort of the progression that we proposed. With that, I will end. I'm a little bit over, and apologies for that. Thank you so much. We'll be posting the recording. We're happy to seek out answers to any questions. And if you want to discuss further, reach out to us at Better Ballot Iowa. We can drop the link to our website, and we're happy to follow up with any questions you have. And with that, I think I'm ready to stop sharing and introduce our first speaker, Chris Hughs, who is with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And Chris, I'll hand off to you to tell folks a little bit more about yourself and your personal story.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me today. My name is Chris Hughs. I'm the Director of Policy at the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, like Matt said. And I have a million slides. I'm not planning to go through every single one of them, but I have them mostly because I want to have some visuals and a couple notes in case people do have questions about any number of topics on ranked choice voting implementation. So a bit about the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that studies, advises on, and supports ranked choice voting elections across the country. So what that means is me and all my coworkers spend a lot of time actually studying ranked choice voting elections, looking at ballots, looking at voter behavior, looking at the equipment and all the sort of behind the scenes work that's done to run ranked choice voting elections, so that we can better understand what it takes to run a good ranked choice voting election, and can give that advice both to election administrators like yourselves, people who are facing down the prospect of running a ranked choice voting election and might have a lot of questions about how that's actually going to work in your backyard. And so that we can talk policymakers and ranked choice voting advocates and other people, other stakeholders through the process so they can design effective legislation for ranked choice voting so that you don't have to go through a legislature multiple times just because you keep finding like, oh, well, there's this one thing in this one part of the law that we forgot to change. So that's our goal as an organization, is to just make the implementation as smooth as possible, because we know that ranked choice voting elections can and have been run, and 90% of the time you can do a lot of the same stuff other jurisdictions have done. But because every election is a little different, because every state or county has slightly different rules for running their elections, obviously there's going to be a couple of things you have to adapt that might be unique to you. So with that said, what I like to do when I'm talking to people about implementing ranked choice voting elections is just give a high level overview of the places where you tend to see the places where there tends to be the most work, the most adaptation necessary of your pre-existing election administration structure to make it ranked choice voting compatible. And Matt ran through a lot of this already, so I won't belabor the point. And I have examples for all these things if people want to dig in on any of the details. So first things first, voter education. Like Matt said, you need to teach voters what ranked choice voting is and how it works. What we've generally seen is most voters are really curious how to mark the ballot. They want to cast a valid ranked choice voting ballot. And that's the big question everybody has before election day. Then suddenly after election day, they're like, but how are the votes getting counted? And so we find that that's generally how people structure their voter education programs, is they focus a lot on teaching people how to mark the ballot, how to effectively use a ranked choice voting ballot before election day. And then as election day gets closer and immediately after election day, when you're putting out results, you start answering questions, teaching people about how the round by round count works, like Matt walked through earlier. Ballot design, obviously, I'm going to my next slide. The ballot is different in ranked choice voting. This is the ballot from Alaska, where they used ranked choice voting for the first time last year. They use Dominion equipment. This was designed with Dominion's ImageCast election management software. I think that's what it's called. So, generally, this is what a ranked choice voting ballot will look like. There will be some variety depending on the vendor you're working with, and how many candidates you have running and how many rankings may be allowed under your law. But voters are going to get to rank candidates in a grid. I think one thing people were wondering about is if a ranked choice voting ballot can have both ranked choice and non-ranked choice contests on it. And we have seen most jurisdictions that use ranked choice voting have both ranked choice and non-ranked choice contests on their ballot. It's just a matter of, do you put all the ranked choice contests on one side of the ballot and then everything that's not ranked choice on the other side? Do you mix it together? We've generally seen people do that first thing. They put ranked choice voting on one side, non-ranked choice voting on the other side of the ballot. That, of course, depends on contest order laws, other laws that may govern your ballot design, but that's generally what we've seen. So that's ballot design. Obviously, it's a little different. Let me go back to my notes. The other things that come up, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, just an introductory, but I'm happy to go in again if people have questions. The other things to keep in mind, obviously, are voting systems. The equipment you use to run elections, can it do ranked choice voting? I'd say, as a general rule, pretty much any modern voting equipment can do ranked choice voting. And I have notes on that I can show in a second. But that's obviously core to whether you can run ranked choice voting elections. And that's the information we have about vendor RCV capability is how we arrived at that score that Matt was talking about in our RCV maps assessment, which is a county by county analysis of all the equipment used in elections in Iowa to understand whether it can or can't do ranked choice voting elections. The other things too to keep in mind are results centralization and reporting. Like Matt said, to get ranked choice voting results, you need to centralize what's data known as a cast vote record, which has ranking data of how every voter ranked every candidate on the ballot. It's, of course, anonymized data, but you need to run that cast vote record data through tabulation software provided either by your vendor, or we also produce tabulation software called RCTab that can process that cast vote record data and determine the round by round count in a ranked choice voting election. And then finally, post-election processes. Obviously, you'll still want to be able to run post-election tabulation audits, post-election recounts of ranked choice voting. I'll say, like, these have been done across the country. It's everywhere is a little different, both in terms of the exact rules of how they run ranked choice voting and the pre-existing requirements in law on what counts as an audit, how many machines you have to audit, if you have to do a risk limiting audit or just a conventional audit. And there's, of course, a lot of variety in recounts if you have to do a hand recount or a machine recount. We've seen ranked choice voting used in a lot of different contexts. And I'd say generally there might be some new processes that need to be developed if a jurisdiction adopts ranked choice voting and has some particular recount or audit rules for ranked choice voting. But we've seen a lot of places with a lot of different audit and recount policies conduct audits and recounts of ranked choice voting. So I'll just wrap up my introductory remarks by talking a little bit about voting systems and ranked choice voting capability. Like I said, obviously it's the major thing you use to count your elections. There's generally two ways to count elections. There's a hand count. I'm not going to worry you all with the details of that. And then there's voting systems. Like I said, a voting system needs to be able to create a cast vote record, this ballot level data, to generate ranked choice voting results. We've seen any modern voting system, again, can generate that cast vote record. What we've seen in practice is vendors tend to take one of two approaches when they're integrating ranked choice voting into their systems. They either build a tool that can design a ranked choice voting ballot, that can scan that ballot, that can capture that ranked choice voting data, but doesn't do the final step of the round by round count, that tabulation. Or vendors build tools that have the end-to-end everything. You can design ballots, you can capture data, you can get a cast vote record, you can run that data through your in-vendor system to run the round by round count. Of the vendors used in the state of Iowa, Unison is the one vendor who has EAC certification for an end-to-end ranked choice voting system. So it can design ballots, capture data, and generate round-by-round results, all within a single unified unison system. Then you have ES&S. ES&S has their ballot design and ballot capture functionality, that data capture functionality certified by the EAC, but they don't have the ability to run the tabulation internally. You need to export that cast vote record data and run the data through a non-internet connected hardened computer with tabulation software like RCTab, our ranked choice voting counting software, to get results when you're using ES&S. And then finally, there's Dominion. Dominion also has an end-to-end tabulation suite for ranked choice voting like Unison. They're not EAC certified, but they have been state certified. They've been used in Utah, New Mexico, and California for ranked choice voting elections and a few other jurisdictions as well. So that's the time I had for introductory remarks. I'm happy to take some questions now, or I'm not sure if it's going to another panelist.
I think we have a few minutes. I ran a little bit over, apologies for that, but I think we've got enough of a built-in buffer. We did get two questions in the chat. The first one was from James, Scott County. He was asking, I'm curious how RCV would impact test desk creation. Right now, the goal is to test every candidate in every position. It seems like that would add exponentially to the amount of test ballots a county would need in order to test every candidate at every choice level. You're muted, Chris. Chris, you're still muted. Oh, there you are.
Sorry about that. The unmute button disappeared on my screen. Yeah, so that is a good question about logic and accuracy. So what we've seen jurisdictions do is they don't fill out a bubble for every single possible marking someone might receive. I'll actually defer to Josh if he can talk a bit about how Utah County did this when they were running ranked choice voting elections. But what we've seen jurisdictions do is they will mark they'll create test decks where they've ranked at least one candidate every ranking. They test all the different possible voter errors in general, but they won't test an overvote at every single ranking. They won't test a skipped ranking for every single ranking in practice. I haven't seen someone try to test every single possible permutation of ranking behavior in an LNA test, because I think for that exact reason, because it would be a huge amount of ballots to test.
And the other question that we got from Nick, and you started to address this in your talk, but maybe you could go into a little more. Chris said that he saw, or Nick rather said that he saw that Maine has no post-election audit, but Alaska does. How do post-election audits work for RCV? Yeah, Iowa says there should be an audit after every election.
Yeah, so what we've seen jurisdictions do, Alaska randomly sampled a couple machines to audit, and the way they audited it was by looking at the paper ballots cast on those machines and comparing them to the cast vote record generated by that machine. That's also what we've seen places like Minneapolis and all the cities in Minnesota that use ranked choice voting. That's also how they conduct their audit. They see, they compare from a precinct or a scanner, just depending on what law requires. They'll do a manual comparison of paper ballots to the digital record to check that everything was tabulated correctly. And just because you asked about audits, risk limiting audits have been piloted for ranked choice voting elections. There will be, there was one conducted in San Francisco in 2019. There were a few conducted in 2020 after some presidential primaries used ranked choice voting in their elections. And Arlington, Virginia is also going to be running a pilot this summer. The thing that has stopped growth in risk limiting audits of ranked choice voting more is that most places that have ranked choice voting don't have an RLA requirement, so no one has felt the need to develop the software. But there's also, honestly, that's the primary reason. And the other thing is that we only just recently figured out all the sort of back end math necessary to do risk limiting audits of ranked choice voting, but that has been sorted out. So it's just a matter of finding more jurisdictions like Arlington that want to run pilots so we can further develop post-election auditing software for ranked choice voting elections for risk limiting audits specifically.
I would just add that that I've seen on your website, there's a paper on how risk limiting audits would work, and we're happy to share that link after this call. In keeping to our slightly shifted time, we've got about 1 more minute. Are there any other questions for Chris? Feel free to use the hand raise or to type. I think we have an example that we were sent by Fair Vote of a mixed ballot. And I know that a lot of, you addressed this when you were speaking, Chris, but a lot of places or a lot of people here in Iowa have been asking about that. So later in this call, I could maybe share the one that they sent me as an example of how it's done. Yeah, and Josh commented, but since Josh is next up and we are at 3:35, why don't I introduce Josh Daniels? Josh Daniels was an auditor in Utah County, and I'll defer to you to tell more of your story, Josh, and a little bit about your experience.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Matthew. So good to be with all of you. I personally grew up in the Midwest in Topeka, Kansas. But now live in Utah, where I recently served as the county clerk and county auditor, two different offices, but combined for the second largest county in Utah, which is called Utah County. We're a county of about 700,000 people. Most of those people are in baby carriages, and we have 350 registered voters of that 700,000 population. 2 major universities with about 75,000 college students in our county. And our county was the first to implement ranked choice voting elections for those municipalities that chose to do it in Utah during the 2019 cycle of municipal elections. And so I'm actually familiar with ranked choice voting from prior to coming into office as the county clerk and auditor. We're partisan elected in Utah. And so as a Republican state, basically all local elected officials that are partisan elected tend to be Republican, with the exception of some areas of the state. And so in my previous life politically, I was a volunteer and involved in various Republican Party politics. And interestingly, in Utah, for the last 20 years, our Republican Party in its convention and in its caucus meetings have used ranked choice voting from time to time to nominate candidates, to elect delegates that go from those precinct caucus meetings to broader state and regional conventions. And so was very familiar personally with how ranked choice voting worked, and was interested to see how it would be applied in an official, state sort of run election context, which we did for municipalities. So I'm going to share my screen here and share, if I can get access to do that. Here's just a couple of visuals and kind of talk through the Utah experience for us in Utah. Okay, let's see. Okay. So in Utah, with our pilot for municipalities, I like to talk about the 3 Ps, the purpose of the pilot, the people, and the process. So one of the reasons the legislature went with ranked choice voting was to eliminate runoffs. In the example, a lot of states, Iowa included, as you know, municipal elections can often result in plurality victories. And so in Utah, we have a nonpartisan primary and then the general election, which functions as a runoff. And so these municipalities have to pay for the cost of administering these elections, and having 2 different cycles of elections can become costly. specifically because Utah, similar to some other Western states, like Arizona, like Colorado, like Oregon, we are a vote by mail state where we proactively send ballots to every active registered voter for each election. And so it's very costly to send those ballots out, to also pay the return postage for those ballots. And if a city has to pick up that cost to simply narrow the field of candidates in one election cycle and then have that general election or runoff in the fall, that can be the difference of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost for cities. With ranked choice voting, these cities often will just skip that primary election and place all the candidate names in the general election with no need for a runoff. And, you know, when you look at ranked choice voting as a tool, eliminating runoffs is a really attractive option for using ranked choice voting. Some states in the South have even done this for their overseas voters. So think about Georgia with their runoff elections that have happened the last 2 times they've elected US senators. Overseas and military voters oftentimes end up disenfranchised on the quick turnaround for those runoffs. And so they are permitted to submit a ranked ballot that gets counted during the first election with their first choice. And then if a second choice is still in the running during the runoff, they can recount that ballot on behalf of that overseas voter in the runoff election. So, you know, that was one of the issues. Also, local candidates and local communities just kind of sometimes tire of the campaign cycle and having 2 different periods of time where signs are strewn about the community and candidates are running for office. In the case of Utah, our primary election is in August, which is just an awful time for people to have to campaign. It's not only hot to knock on doors, but people are out of town and on vacation and busy, and voter turnout tends to be pretty low in that primary. And so simply having that one and done November general election without the need for a runoff to eliminate plurality victory is also really helpful. And we've talked about spoiler effect before already. So then we thought, as we implemented, we needed to think about the people that were going to participate. And so in our case, we did a lot of outreach and voter education. You know, the state corralled all the municipalities together and did a joint education program, had a special website, Rank the Vote Utah, to kind of explain how it would work. They put together an informative animated video to show how it worked. And we were proactive in trying to reach out in the community. One interesting thing that we did was we went to some assisted living centers and senior centers to do some ballot testing and just kind of gave participants sample ranked ballots to see what their response would be, to gauge whether or not there was natural confusion without any kind of instruction. One of the things that was surprising is that the test groups that we worked with seemed to show no sense of confusion over the ballot, and with very little instructions besides the ballot itself, were able to successfully rank their choices. And basically what that taught us is that a ranked style ballot by itself is intuitive enough for the vast majority of voters. And the idea that something new and complicated might be confusing just didn't seem to bear out in our experience. One of the other things that we did during this pilot was we tracked all service calls that would come in to our office during the election period and categorized why the caller was calling. And we found that less than 1% of callers during the election period were actually calling specifically about something related to ranked choice voting. And then after our elections, we did some polling of voters who participated to see their satisfaction level. And we're quite surprised to find that over 85% of respondents said that they supported ranked choice voting and either wanted to keep doing it in the city elections or even expand it to statewide elections. And 85% found the ballot easy to use and not confusing. In 2021, the second year of the municipal election pilot, we had 23 different cities across the state participate. This is just kind of a listing of the various cities across 5 different counties in Utah. And then talking about the process to administer a ranked choice election. So ballot design, in our county, we're a client of ES&S. And the first year, ES&S designed our ballots on contract, which was our previous practice. But then we went to the program your own ballot subscription with ES&S and had the capacity and expertise inside our office to design our own ballots. Nothing about the ballot design seemed to be different than our process would normally be. Yes, the ballot looks slightly different, but the process of designing that ballot isn't significantly different than designing any other ballot. And I'll show you an example of what it looks like. Tabulation was the same. Ballots were processed and scanned in mixed fashion with non-RCV ballots on the same equipment that we already had. Didn't require any changes in our equipment or our systems or our processes or our software. The important function at the very end, though, as Chris talked about, was to take that data file and to run it through the utility RCTab, which is free for election jurisdictions to use. And that automates the process of determining the winner through the instant runoff voting process. We also did post-election auditing like we do every other election. We are likewise required to do a post-election tabulation audit, which is where we are looking to see that the equipment counted the ballot correctly. We don't do a risk limiting audit, an RLA, so we're not testing against the ultimate outcome of the race. We're simply confirming that the random sample of ballots selected to be audited match the results that the tabulation system assigned as the result of those ballots. And didn't have any problems with our auditing process when we did ranked choice voting. In terms of test deck for our logic and accuracy or LNA tests at the beginning, we did have test decks. We did have many of the various combinations tested. I do believe our test decks were slightly larger than they normally would be, but we're talking maybe twice the size. So instead of 50 pages, we might have had 100 or 125 pages or something like that. But we were able to follow essentially the same procedure. And then we were able to report results on election night, as we do with all the other types of races. One utility that was helpful is this visualizer tool, RCViz, and I'll show you an example of what that is and how that helps to display results. Here's an example of a ranked ballot that would be sent out. This one is for Salt Lake City. So you can see first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, fifth choice. It's a grid style ballot. There's lots of cool tools out there on the internet where you can kind of run your own digital ranked choice voting demo that have similar kinds of design. But these paper ballots were sent to all of our voters. They filled them out, mailed them back. One issue is with paper ballots, voters, of course, can make errors as they tend to do, whether that's overvote or undervote. And we didn't seem to detect a significantly higher case of undervotes and overvotes in the ranked races. We always get voters that even in a plurality race where you can mark only one name, they might mark two names. And so in like fashion with ranked choice voting, maybe they'll rank one, more than one person their first choice. And that would be an overvote. You wouldn't be able to count that vote. But that happened at the same instance or rates that it happens with other traditional ballots. But it is something to look out for. So let me share a couple of these examples. Okay, so I talked about how in the Utah Republican Party, we've used ranked choice voting in the past. You might be familiar with the name John Huntsman Jr., who ran for president a few years ago. He was the former governor of Utah. And back in the year 2004, the Republican delegates of Utah met in their state convention to nominate a governor candidate to replace the outgoing governor who had been appointed at that point in time by George W. Bush to be one of the cabinet members. His name was Levitt. So in that vacancy, basically every major political character in Utah was running for governor. A couple of members of Congress, a couple of former speakers of the House in our legislature, John Huntsman Jr. And so in this very crowded field for governor, if we would have done multiple rounds of voting in this convention, the 4,000 delegates would have been at the convention hall for probably 8 hours on a Saturday. And so the Republican Party used ranked choice voting that year, and it worked out quite nicely. because, voters could express preferences on every round of the election without having to stay around and vote in multiple rounds. And this is how this visualization tool shows the winners. John Huntsman was an early lead. Nolan Terrace was a former Speaker of the House. Olene Walker was the acting governor as the former lieutenant governor. Marty Stevens was a former Speaker of the House. Fred Lampropoulos was a wealthy businessman like Huntsman. Jim Hansen was a congressman. Harley Hellawell was a state senator. Gary Benson was a state representative. So there was just a lot of these people. So as we went through the rounds, what was interesting was the way that the coalition of voters in the delegate pool consolidated behind different candidates. Ultimately, while Nolan Terrace had been in the lead, you'll see in this round, Fred Lampropoulos now beats Nolan Terrace in this round. But once Olene Walker's eliminated, her votes consolidate to Nolan Terrace. And in the end, there was a primary between John Huntsman and Nolan Terrace. The way Utah's system works is typically the top two candidates move on to a primary, and the Republican delegates winnow the field down to essentially be that runoff election. I'll share one other example, which is a city council race that we ran in 2021 that had 9 candidates, and they were running for 2 different seats. And this is how the results looked. And as we went through the rounds and the votes were redistributed, Chris Condi, who was an incumbent and probably a favorite, went ahead and won the first seat. And there's a separate visualization for the second seat. But it just goes to show that ranked choice voting can be used in a multi-winner fashion. So those are a couple of examples, and that's all the slides I had to share. But we really did have a good time implementing ranked choice voting, didn't have a lot of challenges or problems, and we're able to stand up this type of voting for those communities that opted to use it. And when it comes time, I'd love to answer questions. And let me check the chat, see if there's any questions immediately, Matt, that I could address.
So far, there's only been one. James was asking about multi-winner, but then you actually went on to show one example of a multi-winner race in Utah. I'll add that there are slightly different variations on how states and municipalities do multi-winner, but it is a solved problem. Does anybody else have any questions for Josh?
Yes, there was another question in the chat from James in Scott County.
Yeah.
Does Utah have partisan or nonpartisan municipal elections?
So Utah has nonpartisan municipal elections. And so it's really just a bunch of names on a ballot. Certainly if people want to declare that they are part of a party, they're free to do that with free speech, but parties are not nominating candidates. Candidates are not listed on the ballot by party affiliation. And so in the case of, to conflate this with multi-winner, we had this scenario in the city of Lehigh where we had 9 candidates competing for 2 at-large seats on the council. None of the candidates had a party affiliation. And some people thought, well, in the traditional sense, those voters could, in plurality, what's called, I think, block plurality fashion, they could select 2 names from the list. And then whoever got the most votes based on those 2 names that were voted on by any given voter would then win the 2 seats on the council. And what happens in that scenario is there's an incentive to bullet vote. In other words, if you want to win one of the 2 seats, you encourage your most loyal supporters to only mark your name and not mark any other names, because that might undermine your ability to win. And so with ranked choice voting, it completely eliminates the need or incentive to bullet vote, which now gives voters reason to think about and to analyze all 9 candidates. And that if you rank those candidates, you can't hurt your most preferred candidate. And we were really shocked that instances of ranked choice bullet voting, which it is possible to bullet vote in ranked choice voting, were almost non-existent when we use the ranked ballots. And so when you compare that bullet voting tendency with plurality voting versus ranked choice voting, it seems to indicate to me that ranked choice voting reduces instances of bullet voting by as much as 10 times when we looked at kind of a year-over-year example in that city of Lehigh. And because voters receive their ballot in the mail, it gives them 3 weeks to consider all 9 of the names and really think about how they rank those different names. And then what we do is we do sequential IRV, meaning or multi-pass IRV, meaning we run the process of instant runoff voting once to see the first winner for the first seat that's available. Then we run the process a second time, eliminating that winner and redistributing the second place votes for that previous winner to then find out who wins from that same candidate field for the second at-large seat. And that's how we administered the multi-winner election. And that, while that might sound complicated, it was a breeze using the RC tab utility. It literally just took a few minutes, click, 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 and then you have the result. You can upload it to that visualization tool and everybody can see how things tallied out.
So we are starting to slip. We've got time for one quick question that we got from David, which was, what was your most common grumble that you got from anybody while going through the change? And then I think we'll move on to Carolyn, but of course, there will be more time for questions after Carolyn's segment as well. So.
Honestly, the most common grumble is just a generic, I don't like this. It's a, sort of a generic, this is different, I don't like this. And when you start to dig in and say why, honestly, you start to hear talking points that have been promoted in sort of online debates where I think partisan interests are sometimes suspicious of ranked choice voting, and that's been true kind of on both sides of the political spectrum at various times. To be honest, the downside of ranked choice voting is that really loud minority factions are no longer very powerful. And because they're loud factions, they're going to be really loud when you change the rules and make it less likely that they can win. Having been a partisan political campaign operative in the past, I've been involved in discussions of strategy where people sit around and say, well, we can win if we recruit this other candidate to also run and play spoiler against, whomever we're trying to beat in this race, would give our chosen candidate a better chance of winning. And those discussions are real, they happen. Those strategic moves are made by political actors. And when you introduce ranked choice voting and you essentially disincentivize or eliminate that type of a strategy from helping somebody to win, those political actors are going to get upset and frustrated because now they can't game the rules to determine the outcome, and they have to change their strategy. Essentially, those are the biggest grumbles we got. The average voter that isn't strategic loves the system and didn't really have complaints.
Thank you so much, Josh. With that, we should move on. As I mentioned, Carolyn Tolbert is a professor at University of Iowa and a researcher in voting and elections and particular expert on ranked choice voting. And with that, I will hand it off to you.
Okay. Hey, so great to be here. And I have just learned so much from Chris and Joshua today. And I have been studying ranked choice voting for a long time, but to hear it on the ground and the use of the software and just the mechanics. I also study election administration, and we actually have a book called with Oxford called Making Elections Accessible. So I care a lot about election administration. Just real quick, what I have studied throughout my career are just election rules of all stripes and varieties. So I started by studying ballot measures or initiatives on the ballot. I've studied term limits, tax limits. I've studied redistricting. We've studied all sorts of election in terms of mail voting, early voting, et cetera. And I teach graduate statistics at the University of Iowa. So I really am kind of a data person or a data methodologist. And so for us, what was really fascinating about this is this potentially better system. And could we see empirical evidence looking at data where the outcomes might be improved? So we have written quite a bit about this topic. Let me see if I can, let's see. slideshow. Okay, yep, we're good. And so we have, and one thing I should say, if you care about any of this, is that we really care about open access publishing. So we pay to make all these articles be open access. So almost all the articles on ranked choice voting that have my name included and Todd Donovan, you can find full access online. And that's really important for us, that people who are interested can actually see the results themselves. So I just wanted to show you 3 articles, but we have numerous other ones. And you can, if you just go to Google Scholar or type in the name Todd Donovan, he's at Western Washington. And I should say he's also, Josh, he's a county commissioner in Whatcom County. So he's also a local official. And then, and we've been working together for a long time on a lot of issues. So one of the, let's see how I can make my, yeah. So I think one of the most kind of interesting parts about ranked choice voting is just this idea of whether it can change how candidates campaign. If you think about it, households are either very positive for children or negative for children. And a lot of that has to do with how do the parents structure that household? Are they collaborative and positive, or is there negativity? In a similar way, candidates really structure elections in the United States, and how candidates campaign and act can really affect whether voters want to be involved in politics and participate, or whether they don't. And so one of the things, there's quite a bit of cross-national research about this, because basically the alternative vote or ranked choice voting is used extensively in other countries, including Ireland and Australia. And so what we're interested in other papers, but this follow-up paper is basically whether allowing candidates to campaign for second and third place votes moderates how they behave and gives them an incentive to not be as negative and to have more civility in campaigns, and to broaden their base. So is there evidence from candidates running in these elections and voters of less negativity, more civility? In this paper I'm going to show you right here, we're basically looking, we're using surveys from candidates that ran in ranked choice voting elections and matched cities that didn't have ranked choice voting. And I should say that Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Des Moines are actually part of the sample that are the non-RCV cities in this study. We also are looking at the 2022 New York City mayoral race that had the largest total number of people who use ranked choice voting so far in the United States. And this is just kind of an overview. We find subtle differences in campaigning reported by candidates in RCV, and plurality would be, Matt, what did you call it? You didn't call it plurality, you called it single choice.
Single choice, yep.
Single choice. And I'm going to show you some of just what it looks like on the ground. And you could think of this kind of like a medical study. So whenever you see a new drug that comes out, and I know because my son just needed something and there were different medical solutions. And I started reading all the medical drugs, all the medical trials, and literally looking at what were the rates of remission of some condition. And in a similar way, that's kind of like what we're doing here. And we will show you some evidence that candidates in these cities actually perceive that the tone of the campaigns was more positive, and that voters in these cities that use ranked choice voting view the campaigns as less negative. There is some nuances though with front runners who may not see campaigns as less negative, even in RCV contexts. And one of the confusing things about studying this is it's got lots of different names: ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, the alternative vote, choice voting, preferential voting, so that they all kind of are the same thing. And, okay. And the thing that we're interested in here is this idea of appeals to candidates to rank rivals. And that's kind of, that's a trippy thing. You're imagine two competing sports teams and you're asking the opponent to, say good things about the other team. That's what we're talking about right here. There's some recent research coming out of the Alaska Republican primary that was showing this moderating effect that the candidates were endorsing one another. In the New York City mayoral race in 2021, we definitely saw rival candidates endorsing one another, and Yang specifically made appeals to support Garcia. And then there's some innovative research from Martha Croft. She's down at UNC. Well, no, forget that. I'll get her school. But she looks at the tweets of candidates running in RCV contests versus not. And she shows that actually they're just more likely to endorse other names. Let me see. Why am I not getting myself to forward? Okay. So what are we hypothesizing? That candidates and groups will be asking voters to support multiple candidates in RCV contests, and that'll be more than in choice voting contests. We expect candidates to perceive in RCV contests less negativity compared to choice voting contests, and we expect voters to do the same. And then supporters of RCV candidates who were told to support another person should also, if you're running and a rival is asking people to support you, they should expect less negativity. Anyway, this is a relatively small sample. It turns out it's very, very hard to survey actual candidates who run in local elections. And this is a mail survey of actual candidates who ran in local elections. You can look at the ends. It's 143 in choice voting cities, and that includes Des Moines. The choice voting cities includes Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, and 69 in ranked choice voting cities. And you can see that there's not that much difference in how many did you ask people only to vote for yourself, but there is a slight difference, about 3% more, where the candidates said that you should vote for you and another candidate. This is also from the same candidate survey, and I think the big thing here is if you look on this second point right here, do you see my cursor, Matt?
No. Oh, there.
Don't see my cursor?
Yep.
Okay, well, anyway, if you look at the bottom section and the third row down, you'll just see that groups, were there groups working on behalf of candidates opposing you that instructed people how to vote? Yes. Some people told people to support multiple people in my race. You'll see that there's like 9% more in the ranked choice voting cities. The candidates themselves are saying they were experiencing groups telling people to vote for multiple candidates. Just more evidence. The big thing, and this is kind of hard to understand, but basically the candidates running in these RCV elections, they perceived there to be less negative campaigns. And that's because these RCV cities, it's negative and significant. I'll just show you for the voters. And we're looking at 3 different actual surveys. The first column is from the New York City mayoral race. The second is a sample that includes a number of cities I can show you. It includes 1,244 voters in California. The New York mayoral race was a sample of almost 4,000. California was a sample of 1,200, and it was a number of cities. And then the 213 sample included many Midwest cities, including Minnesota, Iowa, and other cities. And so asking for voters, this is now a voters reported of candidates asking for second or third place rankings in these cities. And overall, about 30% of voters reported that candidates said, hey, rank me second, hey, rank me third. So that's about the rate that we're seeing asking for second or third place votes. So it's not that everybody's going to be asking for second or third place votes, or at least this is what our data is showing. This is voters, again, in these three separate cities: New York, the big survey in New York, the California cities in 2014, the Midwest cities in 2013. And you can see less negative in New York. It was a pretty contentious mayoral race. 60% thought it was the same, but about 40% thought it was less negative. And in the California cities, that little star just means compared to the choice voting cities. Most voters thought that the campaigns were less negative across the California cities compared to the ranked choice voting cities compared to the choice voting cities. And half the voters in the Midwest cities in the 2013 national sample thought that the campaigns were less negative. And this I just think is interesting. If you were following the mayoral election in 2021, if you voted for Garcia and Yang told people to vote for Garcia, you thought the campaign was less negative. If you voted for Wiley and Garcia told the Garcia people said vote rank Wiley, you thought the campaign was less negative. Eric Adams, who ended up being elected as the mayor, was the front runner. He also was opposed to ranked choice voting, and people who voted for Eric Adams didn't perceive less negativity. So this idea of more civility, it has some limits in terms of how far it extends to the front runner. I just want to show you real quickly a second article that was just published. That one was in 2023. This is in 2022. This is kind of very similar, I feel, to what Josh was talking about with Utah, which is just saying who understands ranked choice voting in these different cities. Again, we're looking across, we're looking in 2021 in New York, in the New York City Democratic primary, but also in those cities in nationwide, basically cities in California and across the Midwest. And basically what we find is really high levels of understanding of ranked choice voting. No systematic differences by race, ethnicity. This is a big issue because some of the earlier research claimed that ranked choice voting would confuse voters. No systematic differences by age. More educated people were more likely to understand ranked choice voting. And so I'll just show you a little bit of what it looked like. Here's New York City. There's the cities that use ranked choice voting in 2014 and all the Midwest cities in 2013, Midwest and some others. But you can see how high overall, how well do you think you understand ranked choice voting? I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. How do I go back? Wait, I go back. Okay, sorry. You can see how high this is, these percentages are. And when you voted, how easy was it to understand the instructions? Again, extremely high. Did you rank, if it was a mayoral race, did you rank? And I think one of the ways that we understand whether people understand ranked choice voting is just whether they did it. And in New York, 87% of the voters ranked. In the California cities, it was 80. In the Midwest cities, it was 78. This is just showing you controlling for all other factors. So using multivariate regression and controlling for gender and age and other factors. This is just showing who said that it was they understood ranked choice voting extremely well. And New York had better education campaigns. And so you had more people in that highest category, but you just don't see differences for old people, for lower high educated people, and you don't see real differences based on race. And this is your probability of understanding the voting instructions. Again, you just don't see differences based on race, age, or education. And this is not a study by us. This is by two other young scholars, and I just will show you, they just published this paper in 2023. And they basically show that voters who thought that there was a more positive campaign environment and were asked by candidates to include them in their ranking were more likely to rank more candidates. And I just kind of highlight these practitioner points. They argue that ranked choice voting was successfully rolled out in New York City. They were saying they thought there should be more education efforts for minority voters. I think this is a little bit of a complex finding because Eric Adams, who was the African-American candidate who ended up winning and had the most support among Black voters, didn't actually support ranked choice voting. So I think this might have been a little bit mixed up. But basically, candidates who ask voters to include them in their ranking, even if it's not their first choice, are more likely to be included in the rankings. That's it. I think the bottom line is there's just some interesting evidence out there that there doesn't seem to be systematic differences in understanding. And I think there is some evidence that allowing voters to rank candidates gives candidates an incentive to appeal to more voters and to not attack in campaigns. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. With that, well, obviously we can open it up to any questions for Carolyn specifically. And we are running close on time, but we still have 15 minutes for general questions as well to all of our panelists. I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet. Does anybody have any questions for Carolyn?
And I should say, I know a lot about, I pretty much know everything that's been published on this topic. So not like you guys, not like Josh and not like Matt and not like Chris, but I know what's been published in the articles. So I can answer that.
Yeah. Somebody is asking if ranked choice voting is more prevalent in the South, and if so, why? It depends, I think, on your definition of the South. Do any of our panelists have a good answer for that? I could maybe comment, but.
Josh just threw this in the chat, and I agree. It's not really typical in the South. Ranked choice voting ballots are used in a number of states in the South, in Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas, to allow voters who are like military overseas UOCAVA voters, who might not be able to participate in a runoff election, to cast a ballot in the first round, in the initial election that could go to a runoff. They can cast ranked ballots in case the contest they're voting in goes to a runoff, so that administrators have essentially those backup ballots. But those are the places in the South that are using ranked choice voting. Like Josh said, it's generally in the West Coast, in the Bay Area, in the Northeast, in places like New York City, and then in the Midwest, it's used in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and a lot of suburbs of the Twin Cities. And then Utah, of course, has a ton of uses as well, like he was talking about.
And I'll add that for those who are not familiar, that Nevada voted yes to ranked choice voting in the first of what will be 2 referendum votes. It won't be legalized unless it passes the next vote. But Nevada is kind of heading towards potentially legalizing it.
I would say the South is more likely to use runoff elections, actual runoffs, which are costly.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make about the runoffs, because that is the reason that those southern states use those ballots for overseas voters. And I think we're right at the precipice of a time when maybe those states, because of cost, might start to seriously consider ranked balloting to eliminate the need for those costly runoff elections. And there are awkward runoffs. I did some political work in Texas, and in the primary election, you'd have like 14 people running for an open congressional seat. And what would happen is the 2 top vote getters, who might have gotten only 12 or 10% between, each of them, accounting for maybe less than a quarter even of all votes cast in the race, they would move on to the final runoff round. and one of them ultimately would be chosen. Such a less effective way for a political party to coalesce behind kind of their most favored nominee in a primary. And it's one of the reasons that even though it hasn't been adopted, probably over a dozen states around the country this year were considering legislation to do ranked choice voting in the presidential primary election. Ranked choice voting seems to be a really good option for partisan primaries to kind of balance the idea that lots of people in the party want to run, you have a crowded ballot, but the party wants to kind of coalesce its support behind maybe its best lead candidate. And it's hard to figure out who that is without something like ranked choice voting. A famous use case recently is the state of Virginia, where the Republican Party used ranked choice voting in their primary process. It's really what they called an unassembled convention during the pandemic. And that's when they nominated Glenn Youngkin, who went on to win the governorship in Virginia as a Republican, which hadn't happened in a while. It's been a Democrat state for a long time, and still largely as a blue state. But there was a little bit of an insurgent win for the Republicans that some credit to the party putting its weight behind its most electable candidate because they used the ranked balloting in their primaries. And so all around the country, both blue and red states are starting to look at ranked choice voting for primaries.
And I should just say, I have studied caucuses and primaries for a long time, and especially Iowa. And in the Democratic caucus, there's basically a form of ranked choice voting because there's multiple rounds of balloting, and you can get behind some candidate, and if they're not viable, you can move and then get behind a different candidate. So that is actually Iowa knows the logic of ranked choice voting because we've been living with the caucuses for so long. Sorry, nobody else knows that. No one who isn't in Iowa wouldn't know that, but if you're in Iowa, you do know that.
It's the right audience.
David had the question for Josh. Are other states reaching out to you on asking about how RCV is working because they're exploring it?
Yeah. I've had a lot of conversations with various people in different states and had people reach out. I've been to a couple different states for meetings, sort of like this webinar and other kinds of meetings. So yeah, we've had some good conversations about that.
One thing that I want to address that came up, I mentioned this earlier at the Iowa Association of County Auditors, was what do mixed ballots look like? And I mentioned this earlier. I have an example that was sent to me just so that folks can see it. When we post this video, we're going to be posting resources and the slide decks of our speakers, so you'll be able to catch up on it. But this is an example, in fact, in Utah, for the South Salt Lake elections, where they had a pick two and they had ranked elections. Yeah, we'll share that, but that's an example of best practices, and I'm sure there's data on that. Chris, another question that came up that I just remembered that I think you'd be a good person to ask about. Well, actually, either Chris or Josh. How do write-ins work with ranked choice? If there's only two candidates, I know a lot of states will then only do a pick one with those two candidates, but then if there's a write-in, there's a possibility that one could maybe argue there should be now a ranked race with the write-in. Is there a policy for how to manage that?
I mean, the answer is it depends on how the law is written. If the law says there's two declared candidates and a write-in required in this contest, then it's possible you'll need to run ranked choice voting so long as there's two candidates in a write-in line. But that depends on how the law itself is drafted. I'd say in general, the way places handle write-ins in ranked choice voting fundamentally depends on how their law has been written. But when they have write-ins, they handle them like they would in any other election. If there's a declared write-in, they'll process all the write-in data using their election management software and make sure that declared write-ins have official votes in the cast vote record and can be included as an official candidate. But if it's only undeclared write-ins, and I'm not sure exactly Iowa's specific write-in policy, I'm assuming there's a undeclared write-in, but that's not always the case. But if you have no declared write-ins, then you don't need to process write-in data. You need to report how many undeclared write-ins got rankings in the first round, and that's about as far as the policy has gone in ranked choice voting jurisdictions. Josh, I don't know if there's anything you'd add specifically from Utah County.
No, I mean, you really nailed it and kind of really peeked into some of the technicalities, because you're absolutely right. We process write-ins and ranked races the same way we would anything else. If they're declared, we process that when we're receiving ballots and we're declaring, okay, these were votes for these write-ins, and those votes might take the form of a ranking. All of that goes into the software like you would any other election. And then as long as that's reflected in that data file, which it is, then you just run it like you would anything else.
That brings up another question that I think came up before, which is how, and I know that this varies from municipalities, but maybe one or both of you could comment on how various kinds of errors are handled. For example, what if a voter ranks a first choice candidate and then skips the second choice and ranks somebody as their third choice? How is that, for example, handled? And what if somebody ranks, somebody with two different rankings? Are there different approaches to how those ballots are managed?
This is another lawyerly answer, so sorry about that, but it also depends. There's essentially three kinds of errors a voter can make on a ranked choice voting ballot. There's an overvote, which is an error they can already make on a non-ranked choice ballot. And I'm sharing my screen because I have a couple different examples just to show you all what some real world examples of what I'm talking about. So this is a normal ranked choice voting ballot. These are screenshots from the city of San Francisco's ballot image data that they publish. They publish scans of every single ballot cast in their contests for auditing purposes and for transparency purposes. So I went through them and found a bunch of examples of voter errors on ballots in ranked choice voting elections. This is a properly filled out ballot. Here's an overvote. Somebody ranked Ryan Lamb first and then overvoted at the second ranking. Some jurisdictions, if you count the first choice for Ryan Lamb no matter what. If Ryan Lamb gets eliminated and this ballot transfers, jurisdictions have taken one of two paths. One, they'll ignore the overvote entirely and go to this ranking, the third ranking, because it's a clear expression of voter intent. And they essentially want the ballot to go as far as possible. Other jurisdictions say, if you encounter an overvote, if you voted for Ryan Lamb, he gets eliminated, and then we see this overvote in the rounds of counting, the ballot goes inactive. And Matt was talking about this right at the beginning of the presentation. And an inactive ballot is a ballot that has run out of valid rankings. That might mean it ran into an overvote. That might mean there were too many skipped rankings. That might mean it just ran out of rankings. You see on this ballot, right, the person only filled out through the third choice. If all of these candidates got eliminated, the ballot could exhaust, go inactive, because it just ran out of rankings to count. In this case, that, like I said, there's two ways. You can either skip the overvote when it's encountered, or exhaust the ballot, cause the ballot to go inactive because there's an overvote. Because you don't, on the other side of the coin, you might want the ballot to go as far as possible. You might want to go to that valid third choice ranking, but you also don't want to assume like, maybe this person did have an equal preference between these two candidates, but we can't make that choice for them, so the ballot goes inactive. Then this is just another overvote where somebody ranked 3 candidates and fourth. People just do weird things on ballots sometimes. This is an instance where someone skipped a lot of rankings. This is a new type of voter error in ranked choice voting. Generally, places have said, if you skip multiple rankings in a row, 2 or more rankings in a row, the ballot will go inactive, because that feels, it's a little bit of a judgment call, but that feels like someone intentionally skipped rankings is expressing, I really don't like this candidate. I feel like I have to rank them, but I don't actually want my vote to go for them. That's the thinking behind exhausting a ballot after multiple skipped rankings. Other jurisdictions are trying to count the ballot as much as possible. So regardless of the number of rankings you skip, they'll count this vote for London Breed, who is ranked 6th, and the vote would just count for her. Again, in an attempt to count as many valid rankings as possible. And then finally, you can repeatedly rank the same candidate. a lot of voters, I think, have this instinct because they really like a candidate. They really want to say, like, I love this person, but your vote can only ever count for them once. If the person you ranked first gets eliminated, your vote will transfer. If you rank that person first, second, third, and fourth, your vote will still transfer. If that candidate got eliminated, your vote can't count for them anymore, and it will transfer to whoever you ranked next. So we generally advise rank as many candidates as you can stand, as many candidates as you like. But there's no value in repeatedly ranking a candidate. That doesn't get you anything more when we're counting up ranked choice voting ballots. So those are the sorts of voter errors we see in RCV.
One thing
And-
that I'd like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Carolyn.
It's just they've done studies about voter errors in ranked choice voting versus plain choice or whatever we want to call it, plurality. And the voting errors are not any different.
Right.
So that might have looked bad, but I'm just saying it's actually, there's studies. I can send Matt the links, but the rates of errors are just the same. We have exhausted and messed up ballots using regular elections.
I actually have a very useful number on that. It's unpublished and I need to double check it and I'll follow up with folks. But I looked at the average rate of ballots that were invalidated in Alaska and it was 0.3%. And then I went and looked at overvotes in Cedar Rapids mayoral race and it was 0.4%. So these are very often genuine mistakes that invalidate ballots or at least invalidate parts of the rankings are as Carolyn just said, typically fairly low. Voters don't usually make those kinds of mistakes, but they do happen and it's important to have a legal path for how to manage them. We are at the hour and a half. Because we were a little bit behind, if folks want to stick around, including our panelists, if you guys need to jump off. But I think we'll only stay on for 5 more minutes in case there are other questions. But I will say, since we are at the hour and a half, thank you so much to our panelists. We really, really appreciate your being here, Josh, Carolyn, and Chris. This was incredibly informative. We've recorded it. And any questions that come to us afterwards, we'll follow up either with you or with others as appropriate. And thank you to everybody who showed up. This is a really exciting conversation, and we very much appreciate everybody being here. Yeah.
The one other thing that I could just tell the group or whoever's left here is that we regularly use the national voter rolls. This includes the voter rolls from each of the 50 states that are appended together, and then include also commercial data combined. And we've been looking at turnout in primary elections. And it's incredibly low. And if that was information, Matt, that you might want for Iowa municipal elections, state elections, we could get that for you, but it's so low sometimes that you wonder if those can be elections. Anyway, I mean, they are elections, but.
Yeah, point understood. I see James has his hand up.
Yeah, so when the software for doing the tally means that all the information has to go to one place. So if you have multiple polling places, multiple machines, do you have security worries about transferring the data from the polling places to the central tally place?
Given that, I would expect there's chain of custody procedures already in place for getting scanners from precincts and other polling locations to county HQ. You should still be able to use those same procedures to centralize, because all the data you need for ranked choice voting will be on the same flash drives or other media storage devices used on polling place scanners now. All that ranked choice voting data will be there as well. The only additional step, especially if you're looking at like a municipal county level contest, is exporting the cast vote record at county HQ after you've gotten data from your precincts and other scanners. That's where we suggest places use their pre-existing chain of custody procedures and other like bipartisan or multi-person procedures used when handling election materials to make sure that you are keeping track and there's oversight for people interacting with election data. But there's nothing unique about ranked choice voting in terms of the security and processes used for handling election data.
So that seems fine for municipal and county elections. I'm just wondering what happens in Alaska, where you aren't going to be able to walk it over to the courthouse
Yeah,
for the
Alaska's
statewide election.
Yeah, in Alaska, they're already running like state-run elections essentially, just because of the nature of the state. So they didn't really have to change anything actually about their chain of custody or handling procedures. That being said, that is an additional thing that we haven't seen a lot of, because no one else, everyone doing statewide ranked choice voting, Maine and Alaska, already had very state-driven elections. We haven't seen places grapple with this question yet. That being said, Maine used bonded courier services to centralize their ranked choice voting data. Alaska used state employees. I don't know exactly what department they were from, but it was all pre-existing relationships they had from the fact that the state is already essentially in control of getting stuff from all their precincts to one central location in Juneau.
And in our case in Utah, sometimes opponents of ranked choice voting have shared concerns that they would have to centralize the tabulation of votes in the state if you had a statewide contest where you used ranked choice voting. The reality, though, is that this doesn't make much sense because we already run elections at the county level for statewide contests and simply upload that data to the state, who then shows it in a sort of combined fashion. So in similar fashion, instead of uploading a 10 kilobyte file that tells the tallies for each candidate, you upload a 30 kilobyte file that has some more detailed data that the state can then compile. There's no need for the ballots physically to go any different place. There's no need to centralize tabulation. Most of the states that are deciding to do some of that centralization are already centralizing election operations for some other kind of reason, like it was described for Alaska. Maine is a state that chooses to centralize some of their operations for specific operational reasons, unique to Maine. In the case of most states where you're already sharing, top line result data, often digitally, in our case in Utah, we use a secure file transfer protocol, SFTP site, where we upload these data reports to the state and they compile them. You can do similar with the ranked choice data and then compile them and then use that sort of tabulator utility to run the IRB process to determine the winners.
I think we should probably end here because we are going 10 minutes over and I want to respect everybody's time. But that was actually, I think, a really interesting and very useful line of questioning. I'd also add that the cast vote records are made publicly. So as long as you trust that the counting done at each of the precincts was correct and they all store their paper records, the nice thing about RCV elections is you can run the tabulation yourself with your own software from home for a lot of locations. Alaska and Maine, I think, both give their full cast vote records publicly. Yeah, thank you all so much. As I mentioned, I'll reiterate, there's only a few left, but we're happy to follow up with one-on-ones. We have a lot of follow-up questions ourselves, but we really appreciate everybody being here, and we'll hopefully talk to you all again soon. Take care.